It began with a flash, one that never truly happened. On the 26th of September, 1983, a Soviet satellite detected what appeared to be a nuclear missile launched from the United States, heading straight towards Soviet territory. Within seconds, warning sirens blared deep inside a secret bunker south of Moscow. Red lights pulsed, alert codes flashed, and one man, a single man, had to decide whether the world was about to end. He wasn't a general, he wasn't a politician. He was a lieutenant colonel, standing alone before a bank of computers that screamed maximum threat. The protocols were clear: report the attack, trigger the Soviet nuclear response, launch the counterstrike that would vaporize American cities and set off global annihilation. But that night, Stanislav Petrov, against all logic, against all training, said no. He disobeyed orders, and in doing so, he may have saved the human race. This is the story of how civilization nearly vanished, not with a bang, but with a glitch, and how a single man's refusal to follow protocol kept the doomsday clock from striking midnight. But why, in the most rigid military machine on Earth, was such a decision left to one man? And why, even after preventing Armageddon, was he never honored by the country he protected? Let us return to the depths of the Cold War, where shadows and signals meant life and death, and where the slightest mistake could ignite the end of history. The year is 1983. The Cold War is not just simmering, it is boiling. Since the late 1970s, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union had escalated sharply. The Soviets, seeking to maintain strategic parity, had deployed new medium-range ballistic missiles, the SS-20s, in Eastern Europe, with launch times of just minutes to Western European capitals. In response, NATO had unveiled the double-track decision. It would pursue arms control negotiations, but also prepare to deploy American Pershing II and cruise missiles in West Germany, Britain, and Italy, missiles that could reach Moscow in under 10 minutes. This was not a game. This was preparation for war. A war that both sides publicly claimed they wanted to avoid, while privately rehearsing it. In late 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to prop up a faltering communist regime. The West retaliated with covert operations and economic sanctions. The new American president, Ronald Reagan, came into office in 1981 with an ironclad anti-Soviet stance, calling the USSR an evil empire and massively increasing military spending. Nuclear war, long thought of as a theoretical last resort, began to seem, for the first time in decades, disturbingly plausible. Then came Able Archer. In the fall of 1983, NATO launched its most ambitious military simulation to date, Able Archer 83. It was designed to mimic the countdown to nuclear war, complete with warhead handling, coded communications, and full-scale troop movements, to Soviet intelligence already primed by Operation Ryan, a vast espionage campaign aimed at detecting surprise attacks. Able Archer looked less like a drill and more like a prelude to the apocalypse. Meanwhile, Soviet leader Yuri Andropov, once head of the KGB, viewed Reagan not as a bluffing politician, but as a fanatic who might just push the button. Paranoia reigned. Soviet commanders were ordered to prepare for the unthinkable, and in the midst of this storm came the incident that nearly lit the fuse. In the early morning hours of September 26, 1983, Soviet early warning satellite Cosmos 1382 registered a thermal event, the heat signature of a missile launch from deep within Montana. The satellite's onboard systems confirmed it. Then another launch, and another, 5 in total. On paper, this was exactly what a real first strike might look like. not thousands of missiles, but a few launched to blind Soviet radar and cripple its ability to respond. In the Serpukhov 15 command center near Moscow, alarms screamed, flashing screens read missile attack. The officer on duty, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, not a career warrior, not a fanatical ideologue, but a system analyst trained to think critically, not mechanically. The next 17 minutes would define not only his life, but perhaps the fate of the world. Stanislav Petrov was not supposed to be there that night. He was filling in for another officer on the night shift, a twist of fate as quiet as it was monumental. He boarded a small military minibus that evening, riding down a narrow forest road toward a facility that officially did not exist. The gate read Center for the Observation of Celestial Bodies. In truth, it was the beating heart of the Soviet Union's nuclear early warning system. Serpukhov 15. Behind thick concrete walls, hidden from the outside world, lay the OKO system Russian for eye. It was a fledgling network of satellites and computers rushed into operation to match America's technological edge. The system had only been operational for a year. It was fragile, complex, and, as Petrov knew all too well, deeply imperfect. He was not just a man watching the system. He was one of its designers. A career scientist and engineer, Petrov had helped write the manuals and test the algorithms. He knew the limits and the assumptions behind every flashing light and computer beep. When he was promoted to lieutenant colonel, it wasn't because of battlefield valor. It was because he understood the code. At 12:15 a.m. on that night, a red light flared on the main console. The siren screamed. The screen declared, "Single missile launch detected, maximum probability." Protocol demanded immediate escalation. Had Petrov followed it, his next move would have been to report the alert as genuine, to pass it up the chain to the Soviet General Staff, which had standing orders to launch a full retaliatory strike. One phone call, that was all it would take. Instead, Petrov hesitated. Why only one missile? Why not hundreds? The American doctrine of nuclear war was built on the concept of overwhelming first strike. A few missiles made no strategic sense unless they were a decoy or the first wave of something larger. He waited, no confirmation. No visual confirmation from ground-based observatories, just a satellite alert. 2 minutes later, another alarm. Then another. 5 missiles in total. Maximum threat level. Inside the bunker, men stared at him. Breath held. Officers at their stations clutched phones, waiting for the order. Petrov did not give it. Instead, he picked up the secure line and told his superiors it was a false alarm. There was no proof, no second opinion, only his instinct and his unwillingness to be the man who started a nuclear war based on computer code he didn't trust. He would later describe it as the longest 17 minutes of his life. That was the time it would take for a missile, launched from Montana, to strike Moscow. 17 minutes of silence, 17 minutes for the fate of the world to hang on a razor's edge, balanced in the mind of one Soviet lieutenant colonel. At any moment, a flash in the sky or a shaking floor would confirm he'd made a fatal mistake. But it never came. No explosions, no blinding lights, just nothing. The alert, it turned out, was triggered by a rare and deadly coincidence. Sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds, picked up by the satellite's infrared sensors as a signature of a missile plume, a simple, tragic flaw in a machine built to watch the skies. But the world did not burn, because a man said no, because he thought instead of obeyed. For most of the Cold War, The doctrine of mutually assured destruction had held the world in a tense, trembling equilibrium. The logic was grotesque but clear. If either side launched nuclear weapons, the other would respond in kind, and both societies would cease to exist. No winner, only ashes. But that balance rested on machines and the assumption that they would never make a mistake. What the incident at Serpukhov 15 revealed was far more terrifying. The margin for error was not zero. It was razor thin, one false signal, one tired operator, 1 second of blind obedience, and the world as we know it could disappear. And yet, Petrov's actions did not bring him glory. There was no medal ceremony, no public honor, no parade. Instead, there was silence. The incident was classified, his report, a dry, technical explanation of the false alarm, was buried. His superiors criticized him for not recording the incident properly. He was reprimanded, demoted, eventually forced out of the military. He told no one what had happened. Not his wife, not his children, not even his closest friends. It wasn't until years later, after the fall of the Soviet Union, that the story began to leak out, not through official channels, but through a single retired general who spoke to a Russian newspaper. Still, few listened. Petrov lived in poverty. His pension was less than $60 a month. He could not afford a telephone. He nursed his dying wife, scavenged for food, and quietly faded from public life. Only in the West did the magnitude of his actions begin to be recognized. He received the World Citizen Award from the United Nations, invitations from television networks, interviews with stunned journalists. He was hailed as the man who saved the world. And yet, when asked if he considered himself a hero, Petrov would simply say, "I was just doing my job. I did not want to be responsible for World War I too." Petrov's reluctance to be seen as a hero was not modesty. It was clarity. He understood better than anyone the terrifying fragility of the system he'd been a part of. He did not celebrate that night. He feared it, and he feared even more the fact that the world had not learned from it. The missile warning system, the very one that had nearly triggered nuclear annihilation, remained active. It was upgraded, yes, but the fundamental danger remained: a human hand guided by imperfect machines, surrounded by institutional rigidity and paranoia. Petrov would later reflect, "A computer doesn't have a conscience, but I do. Someone had to say this is not right." After his wife passed away in 1997, he lived alone, unacknowledged in his homeland. The Russian government never officially recognized his actions, never issued an apology for the treatment he received, never erected a monument in his name. It was not until a man in Germany, Karl Schumacher, stumbled upon a story about him in a regional newspaper that Petrov's twilight years took a modest turn. Moved by what he read, Schumacher flew to Russia and brought Petrov to Germany, where he was finally, decades late, given an audience and some comfort. Still, even as honors came a few awards, a brief mention in Western media, a documentary. The world moved on. Nuclear weapons didn't vanish. The Cold War may have ended, but the machinery of annihilation remained. And Petrov, he returned to quiet obscurity. He died in September of 2017 at the age of 77. His death passed almost unnoticed. No state funeral, no national mourning, only a small obituary in a German newspaper, placed by a foreigner who had never forgotten what the world had almost lost and whom it owed everything to. It was only after his death that a plaque was placed in his honor, not in Russia, but in Germany, in his homeland. The incident remained buried under layers of silence. bureaucracy, and institutional shame, his gravestone, modest and unadorned, did not even mention what he had done. Cliffhanger, the world today. Today, more than 40 years after the night the world almost ended, we find ourselves in an unsettling echo of the past. The major arms control treaties signed in the wake of the Cold War INF start. Open skies have been allowed to expire or have been torn up. Dialogue between nuclear powers has all but collapsed. Technological advances have made launch times shorter, the battlefield faster, and decisions more automated. Artificial intelligence is now being explored for command systems. Hypersonic missiles can bypass traditional defenses, and the doomsday clock, as of the year 2025, it stands at 89 seconds to midnight, closer to apocalypse than at any point in recorded history, even that night in 1983. Yet, the question remains, will we once again rely on one man or woman to disobey protocol and save the world? What happens when there is no Stanislav Petrov? What happens when the decision is left to software? When war is decided in nanoseconds, will there still be room for instinct, for doubt, for conscience? Petrov once said, one way or another, a person must give the order to launch these weapons. And a person can always make a mistake. But what he left unsaid may be even more chilling. What if the machines no longer need us at all? In a world increasingly driven by algorithms, automation, and code efficiency, the story of Stanislav Petrov reminds us of something profoundly human. That courage is not always loud. That heroism does not always come draped in flags or forged in battlefields. Sometimes it is found in hesitation, in asking the unthinkable, in defying the mechanical logic of war with the quiet logic of reason. Petrov's actions were not just about mistrusting machines, they were about trusting judgment. Even when the cost could have been everything, his story is a monument not to glory, but to restraint. And in a time where restraint seems in shorter supply than ever, perhaps we need to remember him more than ever. This is why we tell these stories, to remember the men and women history almost forgot, to learn before we repeat, to understand that sometimes the most important act is to pause, to question, to say no. Here at Legacy Files, we believe that history isn't just the past. It's the present in disguise, and perhaps the warning for our future. If this story moved you, if you believe these truths must be remembered, we invite you to subscribe to Legacy Files, because history doesn't speak unless someone listens. And sometimes, listening is all that stands between civilization and the void.